What do the country of Iran, hostages in Lebanon, Nicaraguan coke dealers, and Jeffrey Epstein have in common? It's BOAATS episode 10, Iran Contra. That's not a book title or a movie title. That's just the story. And there wasn't a perfect book or a movie for this episode, which is one of the reasons it took 3 weeks. The other is just the complexity of the story. The books that we're going to talk about are Firewall by Lawrence Walsh, which is basically a memoir from one of the independent counsel on the Iran Contra hearings. Nicaragua, The Price of Intervention, Reagan's War Against the Sandinistas by Peter Kornbluh. And Kill the Messenger, How the CIA's Crack Cocaine Controversy Destroyed Journalist Gary Webb. Controversy? We'll get into that. Anyway, but the only movie on the topic is in the same name, Kill the Messenger, starring Jeremy Renner. And that movie came out in 2014, and the book came out in 2006. Now, I want to start with 2 quotes that tie this story to the current period, as I've been trying to do every episode. The first quote is from then Congressman Lee Hamilton speaking to Oliver North during Iran Contra hearings in July 1987, because like so much of what we've learned in the last 9 episodes, and we'll learn in this one, history just keeps repeating itself. He said, "But there's another form of patriotism which is unique to democracy. It resides in those who have a deep respect for the rule of law and faith in America's democratic traditions. When that democratic process is subverted, we risk all that we cherish." And then the second quote is attributed to Senator Warren Rudman in the Nicaragua book, but I can't independently verify it was from him. But in it, he condemned people who, quote, wrap themselves in the flag and go around spitting on the Constitution. And I'm not sure there's a better way to describe the Trump administration specifically and the Republican Party generally today. As I said, this was a 3-week project, and I'm still not thrilled with it because a couple of the books I wanted are still on back order. That story, Kill the Messenger, is about Gary Webb. Gary Webb ended up writing his own book about it called Dark Alliance, which was the name of his 3-part series he wrote and published with the Mercury News, and we'll get into that. But I couldn't get my hands on it, and I kind of got tired of waiting. I think I have all that I need to, because the book Kill the Messenger, which is by a different author, Nick Schou, came out after that. So he was able to incorporate a lot of those elements in his book. And also, there are documentaries out there about the first 2/3 of the story, the Iran Contra piece of it, the weapons piece of it, but not the whole thing. And I say the first 2/3 because there's really 3 overlapping stories here, right? This is just a mind-blowing conspiracy by the U.S. government, mostly the Reagan administration, and only one person did jail time, a retired CIA officer for tax evasion. There were a lot of convictions. Some were turned over on appeal. Others were pardoned by George Bush 41, who we should remember was VP under Reagan and previously head of the CIA, but before becoming vice president. Very difficult to imagine he didn't know all of this was going on. The other challenge in telling this story is that the third leg of the stool stretched out a decade after the start of the first 2 legs. And it took almost that long for the population to understand the full extent of it. And by that time, the country was consumed with Clinton Lewinsky, and we'd kind of moved on. But there's still stories coming out about that third leg, and we'll get into some of that. In summary, then, we'll get into the details. First, Reagan started selling weapons to Iran to get help with getting American prisoners in Lebanon released. Right. So there were prisoners in Lebanon. He was obsessed with getting them released. He decided he was going to go to Iran and ask for their assistance in negotiating with Hezbollah. Okay. And remember, this is right after the Iranian hostage situation in the episode captured in the movie Argo during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, after which we had an embargo on Iran. That's relevant. So, and at the same time, in another theater in the world, Reagan's trying to fund the Contras to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And you'll remember from the Charlie Wilson's War episode that was not going well. And Congress kept trying to cut the funding for that effort at the same time that Charlie was getting plenty of money for his shadow war in Afghanistan against the Russians. Okay. And sidebar, how Reagan got reelected in a landslide and Bush got elected at all in 1988 with all the crimes that were committed under their administration just does not get enough historical attention. Okay. Okay, so leg one, weapons to Iran to get their assistance in negotiating a hostage release in Lebanon. Okay. Leg two is the people charged with dealing weapons to Iran, like Oliver North, but others we'll learn about. They started marking up the weapons they were getting cheap from the U.S., threefold, and using the profits then to fund the Contras. Okay. And Nicaragua had nothing to do with what was going on in the Middle East, just so we're clear, right? They just happen to have a connective tissue named Oliver North, and we'll get into the specifics. Leg three, that was close to being uncovered in the late 1980s by then Senator John Kerry, but didn't really come to light unequivocally until the late 90s, was that the Contras were selling drugs, cocaine specifically, that ended up in the U.S. and using the profits from those drug sales to fund their efforts, okay? Kill the Messenger is about just that third leg, okay? The book Nicaragua came out in 1987, so it's really about the first two legs, as is the book Firewall. And it's with that background, we're going to kind of walk through them and jump around the space-time continuum a little bit. So to start, now the details. Reagan gets elected in 1980, right? He beats out Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign and the independent John Anderson, who showed well with 7% of the popular vote. Reagan was funding the Contras with his stated goal to overthrow a quote-unquote communist-leaning government with one that was more diplomatic to the U.S., I throw in, right? This became known as the Reagan Doctrine. We'll talk more about that later. And he wanted to stop the flow of weapons from Cuba that passed through Nicaragua to communist insurgents in El Salvador, which was a nasty, nasty place at the time. Okay. So quick map discussion, a discussion as I like to do. I figure if I have to check the map, maybe some of you might too. Nicaragua's in Central America, right? And it's right in the middle of Central America. You have Guatemala and Belize just below Mexico. Then Honduras and El Salvador moving south. And Nicaragua below that stretches across from the Pacific Ocean to the Caribbean. And below that is Costa Rica and then Panama, which is connected to Colombia and the start of South America. So in landmass, Nicaragua is somewhere between Pennsylvania and New York State. And the population of Nicaragua today is just over 7 million. In the mid-'80s, it would have been a little more than half that. So a tiny country, really, by any measure. But as he proved in Grenada, there's no country too small for Reagan to flex somebody else's muscle. All right. So we are post-Iran hostage crisis as Reagan takes over in 1981. We're funding the Afghans in a shadow war against the Soviets, and Congress supported Reagan's efforts to fund Contras initially, which started less than a year into office. The quote-unquote support came in the form of the CIA running a covert operation to train and support the Contras, okay? And you'll remember from Charlie Wilson's war, after a couple of years, Congress was getting tired of the Nicaragua story, and they passed the Boland amendments, which restricted funding specifically. And it was they were designed to prevent what Reagan was doing in Central America, The First Amendment was passed in 1982, and they kept having to come back and tighten restriction because Reagan just kept going around them. And everyone seemed to know. And then during the hearings, he said, I didn't know anything, but I'm getting ahead. To evade the ban, Reagan and Robert McFarlane, Reagan's national security advisor, secured funding from Saudi Arabia, right? $1 million a month. And that lasted for 2 years. McFarlane and Oliver North coordinated to supply money, weapons, and aircraft to the Contras, and they were moving money through a Swiss bank account, which again, you'll recall came up in Charlie Wilson's war because the Afghanistan effort didn't want to get taken down by the dirty CIA ops in the Contra war by commingling bank accounts in Switzerland because it was becoming increasingly unpopular in Congress. Okay. Meanwhile, starting in 1982, Hezbollah took dozens of American hostages in Lebanon, aimed at forcing the U.S. out of the region. They also blamed the U.S. for support for Israel's invasion of Lebanon. You'll remember that story from Charlie Wilson's war and the atrocities that were committed and allowed for by the Israelis during that occupation. Also, from a timeline perspective, the hostage taking was after the bombing of the embassy and the Marine base, if you remember that part of the story, okay? The CIA station chief in the area, William Buckley, was taken hostage along with 6 others in 1984. There were layers to these hostage takings, and he was tortured and actually died in captivity. So it was an ugly mess. And Reagan was trying to get all of them released. He was obsessed with it. Now, part of his strategy was getting Iran to help with negotiations by selling them weapons. Right after, again, it's important to remember we established an embargo on Iran, okay? And don't forget, Iran's at war with Iraq almost immediately, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq is our guy, okay, at that time, as always seems to happen with us, okay? Initially, just as we learned in Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan, the deal was Israel would sell the weapons to Iran, and we would replace Israel's weapons from the U.S. stockpile, okay? Same idea, okay? Just keeping us one removed from the real crime. Now, this was still in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, first of all, because we had an arms embargo on Iran, and significant arms transfers like this were supposed to be approved by Congress anyway, or at least they needed to be informed, and they weren't. So after the first weapons sale to Iran, one hostage was released. Not much. It was not seen as a success by the Reagan administration. Then a larger shipment was brokered by the Israelis, again with replacements expected from the U.S. Weinberger, who was the defense secretary, gets wind of it and says, this is illegal. McFarland says the president signed off on it. And George Shultz, who was Secretary of State, says he disapproves, but he won't stand in the way. So no one's stepping up to confront a very, very popular president. It's important to remember. The criminality grows. The shipments the second time around were a disaster. It was short on the equipment that was promised. Some of the weapons had the Star of David on the side, which I think also happened in the Charlie Wilson's War story. I know it sounds like I'm repeating it, but I swear it's a different book and a different shadow war. The CIA finds out about it and is pissed, and they don't want to get in trouble, right? So they get a retroactive finding. They called it, from Reagan, saying that he approved the CIA's actions, basically CYA, after the fact. In January 1986, Reagan authorizes the CIA's direct sale of weapons to Iran. Basically, he just doesn't give a crap about Congress, and he drops Israel as the middleman, okay? He authorized it, and he still, though, kept it a secret from Congress. So Poindexter and North moved forward with weapon sales direct. Now, funding from Congress for the Contras is running low, so this is when Oliver North starts inflating prices of weapons to Iran, and they don't know this, and then they use the profits, North does, to fund the Contras. So he's buying weapons at a discount from our own Department of Defense, marking them up almost 3x and keeping the profits for another covert operation, which is the Shadow War in Central America. Okay, this is theft of a U.S. asset, if anyone's keeping track, right? Congress did not and would not have approved this. Now, it's about this time that North starts working with a retired Air Force Major General named Richard Secord on Iran weapons sales. But they're also working together on funding the Contras. And this is fascinating for a couple of reasons, one of which is that, again, Secord is a civilian at this point. And this is a trend I'm finding in doing all of these pods about CIA malfeasance and no one going to jail. The CIA doesn't do it. They don't pull the trigger necessarily. I know they have, but in so many of these operations, they work through middlemen and then say, they just show, well, we didn't do anything illegal. But at the same time, you have middlemen, as you'll hear when we get to the drug dealing in South Central Los Angeles, will say, I was working with the CIA, and people will back off, How does anyone get in trouble with logic like this? I don't know. And they don't, as we'll see. So Secord delivers 1,000 missiles to Iran in February. And Secord was dealing with a guy named Manouchehr Ghorbanifar as a middleman from Iran. And he paid Secord, and Secord paid the CIA, both in advance. Again, the CIA had bought the weapons from the DOD at a discount, as I said. And with Poindexter's approval, North and Secord marked up the price from $3.7 million to $10 million. And then they kept the profit to pay for arms for the Contras and for other unauthorized, by Congress that is, purposes. Second shipment, still no hostages released, okay? So in May, at Reagan's request, McFarland led a secret mission to Tehran to deliver 2 plane loads of spare parts for missiles and to recover hostages. That was the joint goal of the mission. It lasted 3.5 days and failed. 1 plane had been delivered. The second was held back. McFarland advises Reagan to quit this whole effort. Reagan refuses. 6 weeks later, a second hostage was released. So Reagan says, okay, deliver the second plane of spare parts as a reward and an incentive. And the markup mentioned earlier had applied. The Iranians discovered the markup at this time and refused to pay anything for what they'd received. Now remember, Ghorbanifar had prepaid, and he did it with borrowed money, and Secord had already used part of the payment he received from Kornbluh to buy arms for the Contras. So money's gone. You can't make this shit up, right? So Kornbluh is haggling with Iranians to get reimbursed. Another Iranian intermediary negotiated a sale of another 500 missiles, okay? And just as a third hostage was about to be released, a different terrorist group kidnaps 2 more hostages. And so Reagan's just getting played. And on November 3rd, the whole plot was unraveled by a Lebanese paper. They published a story about arms sales to Iran. Reagan denied any knowledge, of course, and Poindexter and Casey at the CIA wanted Oliver North to continue. So he did. And Reagan throws McFarlane under the bus in D.C. Farland sends a message on his way out the door to North saying, hey, I hope the NSA has been purging files. And North certainly was. Do you remember from the hearings, have you seen videos of the Iran Contra hearings, his secretary, Fawn Hall? So she was a good soldier in North's little army, and she was indeed destroying documents, as she would testify to later. I should have mentioned, if you don't know, who Oliver North was at the start of this. He was a Marine, a lieutenant colonel, and he was just assigned to be part of the National Security Council staff. And there's a lot of groups at the federal level. I apologize. I run through all these names and acronyms. You have the NSC, the NSA, and the CIA. And sidebar in the CIA, as they get to be a bigger part of the story during the third leg, the drug dealing, what other companies, I wondered, could commit this many crimes against the federal government, against humanity, whatever, and still be in business, you know? I mean, except for Wells Fargo, British Petroleum, Boeing, and a few others. But other than that, it's unimaginable how they've done what they've done the last 100 years and still have a nice building to go to work in. Anyway, so back to the book Firewall, the first book, where all this has come from so far. And this is because as special counsel, the author of that book is learning all of this information. He's sharing it kind of leading up to the trials. That's the U.S.-centric part of the story. The Kornbluh book is from the Nicaragua perspective, and we will eventually start over from the even earlier and overlay with the first part of the story before we get to the third leg. Okay, so in Firewall, Congress starts holding hearings. Everyone starts lying. The first plane had oil equipment in it, they said. Reagan is unrepentant. And at the hearings, Edwin Meese, who's Attorney General, who was kind of running the investigation, but also accused of conducting damage control. Participants in the hearing are basically like, take North down for diverting funds from the Treasury. That's the only thing we can prove, and move on. And I think I also mentioned, some document destruction, right? Reagan's fallback was, I wasn't trading arms for hostages. I was just trying to restore normal relations with Iran, the country with the embargo on it after the revolution and the hostage crisis. But it becomes clear he had knowledge of the missile shipments at a minimum, okay? So Poindexter resigns and North was moved back to the Marine Corps. And the title of the book, Firewall, comes from what the Reagan cabinet was building around Reagan to protect him, okay? Okay, so now let's ride that space-time continuum and tell the story again from the beginning, but even earlier, from the Nicaraguan perspective. We go back over 100 years, okay? So as you figured out from the map discussion, Nicaragua was considered strategically important in Central America because of its location. Fair enough. There had been a Marine presence in Nicaragua going back to 1912. And that first time the Marines stayed for 20 years until they turned over responsibility for the National Guard to General Anastasio Somoza Garcia. And then they left. Somoza, he was the son of a wealthy coffee planter and was educated in the U.S., and he initially supported the president, Adolfo Diaz, who was backed by the U.S. as well. It's kind of funny. Who are we to back, democratically elected presidents anywhere in the world? But we do. Anyway, Somoza initially supported Diaz against the efforts of General Augusto Cesar Sedino, who fought the Marines while they were there because he wanted the imperialist Americans out, okay? And so this relationship between the U.S. and who is running the country is typical, right? We want a piece of the economic action. We want leaders who accommodate us, not leaders who represent the people of the country and want the country's natural resources utilized for their benefit. Andino, the guerrilla warrior, was assassinated in 1934, and 2 years later, Somoza, the general the U.S. Marines had left in charge of the National Guard, ousted President Diaz and seized power as a military dictator. So he's there for 20 years. In 1955, the Constitution was amended to allow Somoza to run again. And just after being nominated, he was assassinated by the poet Rigoberto Lopez Perez in September 1956. Didn't matter. Somoza's succeeded by his son, Anastasio Somoza Debayle. And this Somoza was as corrupt and greedy as his dad. There were worker strikes in Nicaragua in the late 70s that were put down brutally. And now who were the Sandinistas? Okay. So now you got another rebel group. They got the name from the previously mentioned Sandino. That's who they were named after, the general who wanted imperialist Americans out of the country. Okay. So a leftist nationalist movement were the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas launched guerrilla raids against Somoza, who stepped up the repression. And then in 1978, Pedro Joaquin Chiron, who was an editor of an opposition paper, La Prensa, he was assassinated. Carter had already reduced aid to Nicaragua. And the U.S. did have some kind of direct settlement with the rebels, but Somoza refused to accept it. And the U.S. tried to prevent a full takeover by the Sandinistas, so they ignored it, and that was that. Somoza at this point started losing military momentum, and he fled to Miami. And the Sandinistas took over in mid-1979. Now, initially, the Sandinistas elected a 5-person directorate, including 3 moderates, which included Daniel Ortega, for what it's worth. But the other 2 were forced to resign. The Sandinistas seized control of TV and radio stations. They censored La Prensa. Controlling the media is always a big part of authoritarian control, as we're seeing in the U.S. right now. And they refused to hold national elections, which is something Trump is moving towards. Sandinistas quickly broke the promise of a democratic government and permitted weapons from Cuba to be transported through Nicaragua into El Salvador, with Cuban advisors in the country on the rise, and Nicaragua even invited the Soviet Union in for assistance. But that's what happens when the U.S. imperialism works against the majority, against the country's sovereignty. We push them towards our supposed enemies in the Soviet Union, or now you're seeing it with China, right? So now enter the Contras, another rebel group, a group that is much more difficult to break down and define because the Contra, the term represents several different factions, not all of whom even liked each other or worked with each other, okay? So, for instance, it included former National Guardsmen, former Somoza supporters, and former Sandinistas, actually, who felt betrayed that the new government broke the promise of a democratic government. So the largest group was the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, or in Spanish, the FDN. And this started in the jungles near Honduras and was supported by the indigenous population there. Some Contra leaders went to the U.S. and actually started lobbying Congress directly for support. So in December 1981, Reagan authorized the CIA to undertake covert operations in support of the Contras. So it was just a year later that Hezbollah started taking hostages in Lebanon, and the perfect storm starts to build, right? Guns to Iran, for help with hostage release, profits from gun sales to the Contras, and eventually sales of cocaine from Nicaragua to the U.S., the connective tissue again being the CIA and Oliver North. But I just got ahead of the story a little bit. So at the same time, a guy named Dwayne Dewey Claridge, he takes over the Latin American division. Of the CIA. And like so many agents in covert ops, I've mentioned this now for 3 episodes. He's from a right-wing family. He went to a prep school and then an Ivy League school. And he was the brains behind the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua, which I don't think I've talked about. That was late 83 and into 84, complete violation of international law. He would end up being one of the guys convicted of perjury around Iran Contra and quickly pardoned by George Bush Sr. He's dead now, but nearly on his deathbed, he supposedly said that the October surprise, which is where the Iran hostage release was delayed so Reagan could announce it at his inauguration. I mentioned that in the last episode, and this guy supposedly on his deathbed said, yep, that was absolutely true. That's what we did. But back to Nicaragua in the early 80s, the CIA is stockpiling weapons for the Contras. In 1984, Congress did approve a budget of $24 million for the effort, which was quickly exceeded. And the CIA started mining the harbors, as previously mentioned. They blew up vessels, one of which was neutral, and led to a lawsuit against the U.S. in the World Court. The U.S. lost, but the U.S. denied the International Court had any jurisdiction. I don't know why we create these partnerships around the world when we basically say all the laws apply to you and to everybody unless we don't want them to apply to us, and then they don't. That's a long-standing behavior. I mean, think Venezuela right now, okay? Now, about this time, a document called the Tayacan Manual was discovered, and that appeared to advocate assassination of government leaders, the sponsorship for which was attributed to the CIA. The full name was the Taikan Psychological Warfare Manual, and it's been declassified, so you can read about it online. My interpretation is that it's just another part of the U.S. involvement in not just funding, but training Contras to overthrow the government by any means possible, which was illegal in and of itself. Recall the specific Boland amendments, not to mention the specific prohibition against assassination. So at this point, Congress, again, has had enough of funding the Contras. So Oliver North is working in Iran on weapons deals, and CIA head William Casey, who tells Contras, don't worry about funding, and he introduces Oliver North as their new contact, okay? And in 1985, Adolfo Calero becomes leader of the FDN, and he's the banker for Nicaragua, basically their side, funding all the action. 1985, Reagan goes back to Congress for money, and the Miami Herald breaks the story about North's success in funding the Contras through back channels. But it didn't get major attention until the Washington Post, now almost defunct under Jeff Bezos, followed up the story and got widespread attention, eventually leading the Iran Contra scandal and congressional hearings taking place. So now it's at the same time that North actually starts ramping up his markup of Iranian weapons sales. He's not backing off. He's stepping up. He thinks he's an American hero, you know. And Secord is in there. He's taking a large sale now and again. He must have gotten crazy rich off this. I tried to find it on the internet. As an independent contractor, one search said he amassed $12 million in cash just from these deals. He only died in 2024, for what it's worth. So Congress had just approved more money for the Contras at Reagan's request when the story broke big time and the hearings began. That's 1986. Later that year, a C-123K plane loaded with supplies was shot down over Nicaragua with a Soviet missile fired by Sandinistas. So hearings are taking place about the illegality of these shadow wars, and it's still going on, right? The pilot and the co-pilot were killed, but there was an arms dealer named Eugene Hassenfuss who parachuted to safety and got captured. And he told his captors, as they always do, I work for the CIA, specifically Operative Max Gomez, which was an alias for a guy named Felix Rodriguez. And that guy was hardcore CIA. He was involved in everything from Bay of Pigs to the assassination of Che Guevara and then Iran Contra. He's still alive. Incredible. I'd once thought that he was an inspiration, at least a name for the character Felix Leiter, you know, in James Bond, but I couldn't prove it on the internet. It seems to be just a rumor. In the wreckage of that plane crash were documents connecting that plane to a company in Pennsylvania, and telephone records connected it to a CIA safe house in El Salvador. Now, to be clear, the Pennsylvania company was not directly owned by the CIA. Per usual, it was owned by Richard Secord, the retired military and active middleman in arms dealing, right? I mean, we know this is a CIA operation now, so it doesn't feel revelatory, but for what it's worth. But it was part of blowing the case wide open back then. It sets the stage for learning about the drug dealing in next week's episode on Air America, because Hassenfuss also shared that the flight originated out of Ilopango, which was an airport and an Air Force base in El Salvador. And that name is relevant as we get to leg 3 of the story next week on cocaine trafficking to the U.S. But for now, it's the base where the CIA launched flights supplying arms to the Contras. And I think we're going to learn eventually drugs out of Central America. So keep that in mind. But anyway, thanks to Oliver North's connection between Iran and the Contras, congressional funding is no longer necessary, right? But then a Lebanese magazine broke the story wide open about the weapons sales around the embargo. And this was just 17 days after the plane crash. And the story blew the doors off Reagan's lies to Congress and the public. Proven to be a liar 3 weeks after he opened his mouth every time. So the Iran-Contra hearing started in May 1987, and we're back to Fawn Hall, North's secretary testifying that, yep, she and North were destroying documents. Meanwhile, to replace proceeds from weapons sales, North is raising money for Contras directly from Republican donors in the United States, which is insane. He's knocking on doors and getting money for this venture, right? Now, North is dead to rights on document destruction. We already established that. And Republicans want him prosecuted for that. And then they want this to go away before it gets to Reagan. So they just decide to ignore the money trail, the profit taking, and take the easy way out. Okay. So we've caught back up to the book Firewall, working through the book Nicaragua. And what we've heard so far is known again as the Reagan Doctrine. I mentioned that earlier. It's basically proxy intervention in the third world to prevent the spread of communism. That's the party line, but also to get favorable treatment for U.S. corporations, right? And the strategy, the execution of the Reagan doctrine has a few parts, right? First is, in this case, the covert operation to support the Contras, right? Then economic destabilization of the existing government, which included the blowing up of the infrastructure, the mining of harbors, etc. U.S. military buildup in the region, try to win the hearts and minds of U.S. citizens at home, though that feels to me like an afterthought if the cover's blown on the covert ops, which it was. Also, the U.S., I kind of danced around this earlier, they had training camps in the U.S. to train the insurgents, and that's where the assassination manual came into play. It was traced to the U.S. bases where Contra soldiers were being trained. So there's no way that they didn't get that manual from the United States, right? But that whole training exercise was a violation of the 1794 Neutrality Act, just added to the list. But those first two steps in the execution, support the opponents to the existing regime and destabilize the economy to get the populace against the existing regime. That's what we did in Iran in 1943 as well, right? If you remember that. So a bit of a sidebar, there was a Nicaraguan colonel named Kornbluh who was chief of intelligence for the FDN, and he was implicated in the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was an advocate for social reform over in El Salvador. There's a whole other story to be told about the death squads in El Salvador, which were heavily aligned with the U.S. government, as the death squads opposed Marxist-Leninist guerrilla forces, and the Guatemalan death squads, which were much more openly funded and trained by the U.S. CIA and I think even Green Berets. In my opinion, all this doesn't get talked about enough in the discussion about why tens of thousands of refugees march up from Central America to the U.S., right? It's much less about what they're going to than I think what they've been running from for over 30 years. And we were intimately involved in some of that misery. And then we complain when they leave their homeland for ours, right? They were political refugees, economic refugees, and climate refugees. And we caused all of it. Anyway, the CIA was funding a second Contra group, ARDC, or again, the Democratic Revolutionary Alliance. CIA was sending them $300,000 a month, and the CIA asked its leader, Iran Pastora, to unite with the FDN, just to show you how messed up the Contras were. Pastora wanted the National Guard officials purged from the FDN because of their involvement in the genocide in Nicaragua the previous 45 years, right? There was an ultimatum, and that created a split within the ARDE, with one half joining the FDN and the other half, Pastora's half, splintering off on their own. Now, at some point thereafter, Pastora was giving a speech when a bomb went off, trying to kill him, but it killed an American journalist. Pastora survived, but during his recovery, the rest of his people joined the FDN, okay? In sidebar, the New York Times was reporting on the Contra War, so this wasn't very covert at this point. And the FDN had an office in D.C. literally, again, so they could lobby Congress directly. And the CIA ended up primarily funding the FDN. But of course, there was nothing, quote unquote, democratic about the FDN. So Reagan's reasons for overthrowing the Sandinistas government and funding Contras was bullshit, right? The FDN by summer of 1984 already were committing gross violations of human rights, mutilation, rape, murder, you name it. Just look at how much money we sent them after we had that knowledge. So though they'd abandoned the original democratic system they talked about, the Nicaraguan government was trying to bring new social services to the people, healthcare, education, housing, and agricultural reforms. And the Contras, again, part of their plan was to set about destroying anything that the Sandinistas did that was favorable to the people, right? In 1985, even former CIA Director Stansfield Turner called the Contras terrorists, a term that is getting reviewed in the current time for its real historical meaning, which seems a bit fluid, but for good reason. The Contras terrorized civilian noncombatants, medical workers, teachers, etc. And here's a quote from a Michigan-born Capuchin priest described an attack in 1983 by the FDN on his parish. And trigger alert, this is graphic. It's horrible. You can fast forward 30 seconds and I'll meet you there. But for the record, this is the quote. He said 20 civilians, he actually called them peasants, were assassinated by the Contras, including women and children. Some of them were terribly tortured first. Most of them were decapitated. After decapitating one little girl, about 14 years old, they put her head on a stake at the side of the trail to strike terror into the people. That's a good definition of terrorism. And those were our guys, by the way. So We talked about the how-to manuals on terrorism, sabotage, propaganda, and assassination. Those folks were operating out of U.S. naval vessels and trained and supplied by the CIA. The CIA and the FDN mined harbors, as I said, with the goal of crushing the economy, like the CIA did in Iran in 1953, which was violating 3 U.S. treaties in the process. The U.S. was condemned internationally, as we are again today. Okay, we violated the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980, the U.S. federal law, just 5 years after it was passed. And Congress voted to terminate aid to the Contras and as far back as 1983. And as I said, we were giving them money a year, 2 or 3 years later, as Reagan was ignoring it anyway. Senate Intelligence Committee certainly ignored it. They were basically working around Congress. So, yeah, in December, the House Senate conferees cracked and authorized $24 million from the Defense Appropriations Bill. There were 4 sources of support over the years. The shadow CIA through the NSC, friendly foreign governments like the Saudis and Brunei calling it humanitarian aid, these American right-wing groups making donations directly to North, paramilitary organizations, including some mercenary soldiers of fortune, if you will, that actually went down there to fight with the Contras. North, this is crazy. North even started a fake fundraiser, a nonprofit called Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. The commercials on TV and in newspapers that sought donations directly from gullible American citizens for this cause, which was his cause, which was Reagan's cause. Okay. So fast forward back again, late 1986, another supply plane was shot down by the Sandinistas and a couple Americans were killed. And Reagan once again denied U.S. government connection. Now, part of the economic war in Nicaragua was the embargo, including killing any economic development loans to the country, like small agricultural lending that can make a huge difference to a developing country. And Nicaragua diversified away from the U.S., just as Canada is doing now, and Europe for that matter, in response to Trump's economic war on any country that doesn't do his bidding. Believe it or not, there were loans outstanding prior to Reagan, and the Sandinistas honored them, making good faith payments whenever they could. Reagan actually tried to get the EEU, as it existed at the time, to cut funding to Nicaragua, and the EU said no. In fact, they doubled their aid to the country. But, the CIA and Reagan's efforts were having their desired effect in destroying the economy, and inflation skyrocketed, and half the country's budget was going just to defend against the Contras, so social programs suffered, right? And meanwhile, the U.S. voters couldn't give a shit about a war in Nicaragua, which was a problem for Reagan, so his administration stepped up the lies to the public. But in November 1986, the public learned about skimming money from arms sales to fund Contras, and Poindexter and North were thrown under the bus. Edwin Meese actually delayed any investigation by the FBI for 4 days so North and Fawn Hall could shred documents, as previously mentioned. And everyone that testified to Congress just took the fist. So that's both first 2 books up to the late 80s. Now let's jump into the third leg of the scandal, the drug dealing. The subject of the book, Kill the Messenger, and the movie started in 1986 when Gary Webb, who was working as an investigative reporter for the Mercury News in San Jose, and that's when he broke the story published in a series called Dark Alliance. That was the name of his 3-part series. And when I first started researching this, I was like, Iran Contra wrapped up in 1987, at least the weapons part of it. How did this third leg go unnoticed for almost a decade? Well, it didn't entirely. It was just ignored, okay? In late 85 and 86, there were allegations of Contras financing their operations through drug smuggling. And the then Senator, John Kerry, started investigating the rumors and held what were called the Kerry Committee hearings. Not surprisingly, Reagan resisted this tooth and nail, but Kerry says he found, quote unquote, substantial evidence linking Contra suppliers to drug trafficking, and that U.S. officials tolerated the activity to support the effort to overthrow the Sandinistas. The final report came out in 1989. It's called Drugs, Law Enforcement, and Foreign Policy. So when they say U.S. officials, who is that? The CIA? Reagan? Certainly North? It's very general. The operative phrasing here is tolerated also because even after Gary Webb published his 3-part series in 1996, the major criticism against him was that he implied the CIA was hand in glove with drug dealers in both Nicaragua and U.S. cities like South Central L.A., when all he could really prove was they knew about it and did nothing to stop it. So this goes back to my earlier comment about how the CIA agents don't usually get their own hands dirty. They have someone else do the dirty work for them. And the CIA is kind of in a support or organizational role. And when things blow up, they can, burn documents, wash their hands, and run away. So the Gary Webb story in a nutshell, and it's a tragic one, is as follows, okay? Here are the players. A guy named Danilo Blandin. He was a Nicaraguan exile and cocaine trafficker who supplied a guy named Freeway Ricky Ross in South Central LA. And Blandin became an informant against Ross in his hearing, and we'll get to Ross, okay? There's a guy named Ron Lister, a former Laguna Beach police detective turned arms dealer. And as you read the story, every time he ran into someone, he would just claim he worked for the CIA. What is that? He wasn't a member of the CIA, but he worked for the CIA, kind of like an asset. That's what he implied. And there's no documents, there's no contract, can't prove any of this, but people left him alone. Another heavy hitter, Norwin Meneses. He was the biggest drug dealer, I think, in Nicaragua, and he was in prison down there during this story. In fact, in the movie, you'll see Webb went down to visit him in prison and interview him. And Meneses supplied Blandin, right? And then Blandin supplied Ricky Ross, okay? Freeway Ricky Ross. He was purported to be the crack kingpin of LA back in the 80s when the crisis was exploding. Another guy, Adolfo Calero, he was, again, a CIA quote-unquote asset. The director of the Contras, he was photographed in San Francisco with Meneses, who had, several homes around the world. But it's just crazy that these guys were hanging out in the United States, having coffee, having dinner, talking business about the Nicaraguan drug trade and weapons sales and all that stuff. To me, anyway. Couple more people. Enrique Bermudez, he was a Contra commander and another CIA asset who met with Blandin and Meneses in Honduras to talk about funding the Contras. So they all knew each other, and there's photographs and documents that put them all in the same place at the same time, if you want to put this conspiracy together in your head. Another guy, Eden Pastor, we mentioned him once before. He was a former Sandinista turned Contra commander, and he was also an associate of Blandin. Okay, so there's some whistleblowers that included a guy named Jack Bloom, the lead prosecutor in the Kerry hearings, Martha Honey, who worked for the New York Times and sued Reagan for his role in the bombing injuries suffered by her husband when he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was our people that blew people up, so she tried. Didn't work, but she tried. Guy named Michael Rupert, who was a former LA police detective who claimed he had uncovered CIA ties to the city's drug epidemic. And he actually confronted Representative John Deutsch at a South Central town hall meeting where the Reagan administration was doing damage control. And you can actually see photos, I think maybe even a video of this online that included Maxine Walters, the congresswoman from LA, yelling and screaming at him that, we knew the federal government was bringing cocaine and crack into our communities. So, and I'll talk more about that at the end. But so those protests happened after Webb's Dark Alliance story broke. And his location in California was fortuitous because Freeway Ricky Ross was on trial in California, and he was gathering info very, very quickly. In fact, during the Ross trial, Webb showed up and he was whispering and handing notes to Ross's defense attorney to ask Blandin on the stand as Blandin testified against Ross, just to get more information on the record about what Blandin's relationship might have been with people like the CIA, which is unprecedented. It's a really cool part of the story. But, because this was almost a decade after the fact, Webb's reporting, he was able to use the Freedom of Information Act and get certain documents, like a report from Lawrence Walsh, which is called as a 1987 Iran Contra report that had info about the FBI raid in 1986 in LA that took down Blandin and Ricky Ross. And there's a document here that showed the LA County Sheriffs knew Blandin was a CIA-backed asset from Nicaragua. That's what they believe, okay? Now, there were other reporters previously who had insinuated a connection between the U.S. government and Nicaraguan drug dealers. Webb's big advancement, why it was such a big deal in the news community, was he was the first one to show that the drugs in question actually ended up in U.S. cities and primarily black neighborhoods. And if you go back and look at Dave Chappelle's earliest couple specials, he jokes about this dynamic. Go back and watch him now, and the context will make more sense to you. Don't sprinkle a little crack on him. Anyway, Webb published a 3-part series called Dark Alliance. is one of the first to ever be released simultaneously on the newly evolving internet, and it went global. It was a huge deal. And of course, the federal government went into CYA mode trying to do to Webb what they did to democratically elected governments in Iran and throughout Central and South America. But more perverse was that other major newspapers, certainly more major than the Mercury News, who were jealous of him breaking a story that they should have gotten and wished they'd gotten, decided to destroy him. So they literally would put a reporter on the case, picking apart his work, back checking his sources and making it look like shoddy journalism. Wow, right? It gets worse. So now the biggest criticisms were that his witnesses were convicted drug dealers. Sure. No CIA agents were quoted on the record. Duh. And there was no proof the CIA specifically engaged in drug trafficking. And if you looked at some of his word choice, it could have been interpreted to be loosely insinuated that that was just the case. Lastly, he misidentified Enrique Bermudez as a CIA agent instead of an asset. And I brought up those semantics a couple of times, but it was considered important from a journalistic perspective. But even journalistically, these mistakes were considered minor, even by his opponents, compared to the import of the story. And most unbiased observers, when they learned the whole detail of his relationship at Mercury News, blamed the editor, who he should have been working with, would have been working with, and who would have parsed language a little finer and kept him out of trouble and made sure he wasn't making any claims that he couldn't back up with facts and interviews and stuff like that. And meanwhile, as I alluded to earlier, Americans were obsessed with Monica Lewinsky and the Clinton scandal. And other than in the African-American communities where U.S. government involvement in the crack epidemic had been a conspiracy theory since the early 80s. And for them, this story confirmed it, while the rest of America just ignored it. Okay. Now, Lawrence Walsh's report, I'm going to read a little bit of it directly because it speaks to the dangerous place we are in today as a country. And this is, in contrast, Walsh's report to what's called the Tower Commission. If you do any research on this, you'll see that come up. I've ignored it because it was commissioned by Reagan to deflect and make it look like he was not part of the conspiracy, but was really looking into it, right? You know, the cops policing themselves. And this was from 1987. So it doesn't even reference the drug dealing, but it speaks to the death threat to democracy when the rule of law and the separation of powers, i.e. checks and balances, go away. I'm talking now about the Walsh report. And that's what happened in the U.S. in the last 12 months. But anyway, here's the opening to the Walsh report. The underlying facts of Iran Contra are that, regardless of criminality, President Reagan, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of Central Intelligence and their necessary assistants committed themselves, however reluctantly, to two programs, contrary to congressional policy and contrary to national policy. They skirted the law, some of them broke the law, and almost all of them tried to cover up the president's willful activities. What protection do the people of the United States have against such a concerted action by such powerful officers? The Constitution provides for congressional oversight and congressional control of appropriations, but if false information is given to Congress, these checks and balances are of less in value. Further, in the give and take of the political community, congressional oversight is often overtaken and subordinated by the need to keep government functioning, by the need to anticipate the future, and by the ever-present requirement of maintaining consensus among the elected officials who are the government. The disrespect for Congress by a popular and powerful president and his appointees was obscured when Congress accepted the tendered concept of a runaway conspiracy of subordinate officers and avoid the unpleasant confrontation with a powerful president and his cabinet. In haste to display and conclude its investigation of this unwelcome issue, Congress destroyed the most effective lines of inquiry by giving immunity to Oliver North and John Poindexter so that they could exculpate and eliminate the need for the testimony of President Reagan and Vice President Bush. Immunity is ordinarily given by a prosecutor to a witness who will incriminate someone more important than himself. Congress gave immunity to North and Poindexter, who incriminated only themselves, and who largely exculpated those responsible for the initiation, supervision, and support of their activities. This delayed and infinitely complicated the effort to prosecute North and Poindexter, and it largely destroyed the likelihood that their prompt conviction and appropriate sentence would induce meaningful cooperation. These important political decisions were properly the responsibility of Congress. It was for the committees to decide whether the welfare of the nation was served or endangered by a continuation of its investigation, a more deliberate effort to test the self-serving denials presented by cabinet officers and to search for the full ramifications of the activities in question. Having made this decision, however, no one could gainsay the added difficulties thrust upon independent counsel. These difficulties could be dealt with only by the investment of large amounts of additional time and large amounts of expense. I'll skip to his final thoughts. The Iran Contra investigation will not end the kind of abuse of power that it addressed any more than the Watergate investigation did. The criminality in both affairs did not arise primarily out of ordinary venality or greed, although some of those charged were driven by both. Instead, the crimes committed in Iran Contra were motivated by the desire of persons in high office to pursue controversial policies and goals, even when the pursuit of those policies and goals was inhibited or restricted by executive orders, statutes, or the constitutional system of checks and balances. The tone in Iran Contra was set by President Reagan. He directed that the Contras be supported, despite a ban on Contra aid imposed on him by Congress. And he was willing to trade arms to Iran for the release of American hostages held in the Middle East, even if doing so was contrary to the nation's stated policy and possibly in violation of the law. The lesson of Iran Contra is that if our system of government is to function properly, the branches of government must deal with one another honestly and cooperatively. When disputes arise between the executive and legislative branches, as they surely will, the laws that emerge from such disputes must be obeyed. When a president, even with good motive and intent, chooses to skirt the laws or to circumvent them, it is incumbent upon his subordinates to resist, not join in. Their oath and fealty are to the Constitution and the rule of law, not to the man temporarily occupying the Oval Office. Congress has the duty and the power under our system of checks and balances to ensure that the president and his cabinet officers are faithful to their oaths. All right, before I wrap this up, a story just started circulating that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in Iran Contra. And of course, these books are too old to even include it, but I'll just get some direct material as to what that means in case you're wondering. In the early 1980s, Epstein was mentored by a guy named Douglas Leese. He was a British arms dealer. And Leese is alleged to have instructed Epstein on arms smuggling, creating shell companies, and money laundering. He was also associated with Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, a key middleman in the Iran Contra Affair, which involved trading U.S. weapons for hostages in Iran, as we know. Khashoggi was reportedly a client of Epstein's Intercontinental Assets Group. Okay, and lastly, following his departure from Bear Stearns, Epstein partnered with Stanley Pottinger, a former Justice Department official who was investigated for his role in shipping weapons to Iran. They operate out of a Manhattan penthouse, ostensibly for tax avoidance. So none of that is a direct connection, but he is certainly right there, shoulder to shoulder with people who were involved, which is mind-blowing. But, you know, the issue remains, what's shocking anymore? You know, comedians are always increasingly saying that satire is dead thanks to Trump. What does it take to get Americans' attention anymore? I don't know. But wrapping up with Gary Webb, after all the attacks on his work, he was demoted at the Mercury News and eventually left. He was unable to get work again as an investigative reporter. He was professionally destroyed by the attacks. And at the same time, his ex-wife was demanding child support, and he had no money. He had to move back in with his mom just to survive. Gary Webb tragically committed suicide in 2004 at the age of 49. Books are Kill the Messenger, Nicaragua, The Price of Invention, and Firewall, the Iran Contra Conspiracy and Cover-Up. And the movie is just Kill the Messenger.